Hello and good morning. Welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede, and we're actually broadcasting to you live from our new studio location. I think we've got one little light in the background here, so we're just gonna probably move the camera over slightly. But other than that, we're doing our best with what we got. I do actually want to let you know if you're watching today that the internet might be a little bit choppy. We're going to try and work on that throughout the week, but we should be able to get through today's broadcast uninterrupted in any major way. Let us know if the lag is too much, and do send along any other questions, comments, concerns you have via email. We'll put that up at the end of the show. Well, we've got some shocking revelations, obviously, out of Kamloops today. So that's Kamloops, British Columbia. That's another kind of regional center. If Prince George is the northern capital of British Columbia, and while Kelowna is the big city in the southern interior, Kamloops, because it's on the number one highway, is essentially kind of the traverse spot between Vancouver and Calgary. Everything that's traffic on the number one goes through there, and it's a pretty major center as well. In fact, a lot of regional headquarters, because it's cheaper than building them in Vancouver and housing them there, where things are quite expensive, are actually in Kamloops. So, shocking revelations about the Kamloops residential school appeared in the media this week. The remains of over 200 Aboriginal children were found to have been buried there. From the reporting that has been given so far, one could be led to believe that all the children were killed with an intent at once by the brothers, sisters, and padres running the school. Of course, that's not what happened, but that's the kind of thing that is sort of being hinted at in the reporting, and our shock from the tragedy is overriding our ability to critically think about that. Being a status First Nation, though I prefer the label Indian myself, I'm a status Indian, that's what it says on my card, especially with my views, is not an easy vocation. I don't regret the white man coming to our shores. I have taken up his religion. I'm thankful for a theology that has a last judgment, not just a spirit world without a hell or a heaven, to be honest with you. Horses, wheels, firearms, let alone modern living, have made life easier for me and my people. My band's name is literally Carry the Kettle, because that's how valued those objects were in the 1870s without a railroad, or a road, for that matter, in the middle of nowhere, Saskatchewan. But contact between so vastly different peoples at different stages of technological development was bound to create tensions and power imbalances. Ironically, the residential school system was developed to help solve some of these issues. And there are many instances of success, as have been attested to by some of the most prominent chiefs and leaders in the Canadian Aboriginal world and the movements. There's some people, I'm not saying that some of the people who are prominent didn't get their motivation from resentment towards the residential school system, and for good reason in some cases. But also, if you go and cross-examine, especially some of the senior leadership, they will have to admit that the fact of the matter is that, strict as it might have been, depending on where they were, residential school was indeed actually their starting place for where they went on later in life and how they were successful. But there is also the fact that there was neglect. There was inadequate funding and food, and outright abuse by certain individuals with intent. And those individuals, whenever they are found, are worthy of severe punishment. And indeed, we don't live in a world with capital punishment anymore in Canada, but I would definitely, if it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt, a jury of peers and ample evidence, and we had capital punishment, I wouldn't think twice about using it against people who had done such things to children. There's no question from me there. And when we discover new tragedies or cover-ups, full investigations ought to ensue. I have no questions there either. Yet we must recall that whatever our complicated past, it is the present circumstances of First Nations, on reserve and off, that ought to be given primary attention. The cycle of poverty won't end after another inquiry. The scars of residential school won't heal from more settlements or public grief. That doesn't mean people aren't entitled to their settlements, but that also won't fix the problem. Our only path to a better Canada is through the truest form of reconciliation, a stake in the political, economic, and social makeup of our country. That can only happen with open communication and good business. Hopefully we learn that before the next tragedy is uncovered. We keep getting these shocks to our system. We keep not being able to kind of face the reality of what's happening. And the reality is bad things did happen, not all the time and not to everyone, but bad things did happen. And we need to do something about that. There's no question we do. But that isn't to create a grief or a grievance industry out of it, which is kind of what has happened in Canada. It is not to say there isn't a place for mourning. It isn't to say there isn't a place for inquiries and for that grief to go on, for us to have proper catharsis. A terrible thing happened. We need to be honest about that. We also need to be honest, though, that when it comes to this particular instance, as far as we can tell, again, the reporting is making it sound as if, this was Auschwitz. Children were all taken there at once and they all died at once via execution. That is not what happened. And we need to be very careful about that. That's a very dangerous line of thinking to take up. That's not what happened. What happened was, over the course of several years, at a residential school where, yes, children may have been there after having been ripped away from their parents. I fully acknowledge that could have happened. And some of those children were there at the willing consent of their parents, and maybe not as willing either. But nonetheless, far away from home, under the care of others, sicknesses happened. Pandemics occurred. We're in a pandemic right now. What would we say about, let's say, a foreign exchange student is here in Canada right now? I mean, it's a different thing, but it's not a different thing. Back then, traveling was very hard. Today, traveling is very easy, except in the middle of a pandemic. If a foreign exchange student in the charge of someone else, especially if they're a minor, right? So they're literally on one of those immersion exchanges, which I've seen several Far Eastern people groups send their children to live in Canada with a Canadian family, like to live there. Fully immersed into that family. It's all but not a foster family, but they're fully immersed, right? They live with that family and they attend school in order to get perfect English and everything else. Imagine if one of those children died of COVID or something else while in the charge of another family. That would be a terrible tragedy, an absolutely terrible tragedy. And due to the fact that infant mortality and child mortality has gone astronomically down since about 1850 onwards, right? And since we started washing our hands, that would look like a terrible tragedy. And indeed it would be. But nonetheless, if this was happening, not even at a frequent rate, but the analogy I'm trying to draw here, or at least the equivalency I'm trying to draw, is that this is not much different from that to a point, because as tragic as it seems, again, in a time where people died more often, especially when they were younger, the fact of the matter remains that this would have been a somewhat common occurrence at that time. That doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it okay. We must be honest with ourselves that we're not talking about, having all of your inoculations or whatever and then still passing away, or passing away after the airbag and the seatbelt were invented. We're talking about people who would have died and had their mortality lived out, and young children, unfortunately. Yes, perhaps in the care of others and perhaps through neglect. We need to look into that more. But also with measles, mumps, tuberculosis, and other diseases still running rampant in a time where we did not have penicillin and the rest of it. So we need to be honest about that. And that, again, the children are not from a single instance of death and destruction or malcontents. We need to be very, 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 very careful about that idea. It still strikes me as deeply tragic, obviously. I am a status First Nation guy, and I don't want my people to suffer. I do feel solidarity with Aboriginals throughout Canada in this sense. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants to wake up one morning and find out that people that you are a part of in one way or another, tangentially perhaps, have suffered another tragedy. Nobody wants that. And so I will admit I'm a little emotional about that. That is hard. But I also don't want to falsely report what happened, and I don't want the kind of hints in the reporting or the bias in the reporting to go unchallenged. I believe that people personally with full intent and consent of the will murdered 200 and I believe 17 children was the final count, or 15 children, certainly over 200 in children in their care in Kamloops. Do I believe that's what happened? No, I don't. And if I could give you a piece of advice, neither should you. That's not what happened. What happened is both from neglect, stupidity, concupiscence, as well as the tragedies of life and the time that they were living in. And over the course of years, unfortunately, many children died. And that is sad. It's sickening. It's hard to swallow. It's hard to hear. But I mean, I don't want to draw equivalencies here because I mean, I'll get pilloried for it. But I mean, do we say the same thing when it comes to abortion? And that's an ongoing issue. Certainly that many children, perhaps more, are aborted every year in British Columbia. We don't have the perfect numbers on that. And do we say the same thing when we deal with other questions? We're going to have Chris Elston on today, and we're going to be talking about transgenderism. A lot of transgenderism in British Columbia, when it comes to inalterable surgery, when it comes to puberty blockers and that sort of thing, it's happening to children in care. So if you think residential school is bad, imagine being a foster kid who has all sorts of complicated background issues, and you're worried, and because of the kind of woke culture that's around you and the sort of things that are being said by counselors at your high school and God knows where else, you're being told that, hey, maybe you're just born in the wrong body or whatever. Your identity needs to be lived out in a different way. Well, if you're a Aboriginal person, a child, an Aboriginal girl or boy, and you're in care and you have these questions about your identity, you could end up having there's no other way of saying it, your sex organs permanently changed, permanently disfigured, literally cut off and changed and surgically altered for the rest of your life, and have your biology completely altered permanently by taking drugs that do things to your system. You know, bone density is affected by puberty blockers, etc. We all know this. And for that matter, most people choose to detransition later, and there's still a high rate of suicide. So obviously transitioning doesn't necessarily work. Especially for young people, especially for people who are in a very confused time in their lives. So I simply submit to you, not that we shouldn't be scandalized or upset at this current issue, this current thing that's come up through Kamloops, and we'll be revisiting this issue over and over again throughout this week because we'll have different people weigh into it. But I, for one, think that we need to be careful because you can't be selective with your outrage. And I'm not saying you should be outraged all the time, but we have what you could really call a genocide. Certainly a ethnically biased way of things going in British Columbia, where again, most of the children in care are, to use the politically correct term, Indigenous. They're Indians like me, that they come from complicated backgrounds, some of which are scars from the residential school system, no question. And due to their parents and their grandparents and everything else. And further to that, they are held in care, and then they're surrounded by people who, of course, because of the status system that we're in, have a particular political bent to them. For every one conservative at the CRA, I happen to know the one, there are 99, people who are left of center and think the state is always a good thing. And that's the way it is whatever status system you're in. Healthcare, education, we have big state systems. And so for every one person who thinks maybe the office could pinch a few more pennies and like maybe not be so extravagant, or maybe we need to think through these problems and not just go with woke HR theory around things and terminology, everybody else is just swallowing the Kool-Aid, or they're doing it just to keep their jobs, which is almost worse because then we're lying to ourselves, right? So we're lying to keep our jobs and pay our mortgages, right? And none of us should be lying, and that's been the big thing with the pandemic. We need to stop the lies because the lies are the virus, right? That's pretty clear. So, but the point that I'm trying to draw here is that you've got these children in care. Big state systems full of people who inherently trust whatever's being handed out in the literature of the last staff meeting. And obviously, between academia and what's happening throughout the big state and our government agencies, woke ideas around gender and sexuality and race are pervasive. And so somebody out there is essentially telling the children, because it is, and this is happening, there's lots of children being transitioned in BC. And we're going to talk about this with Chris a little later. they are committing an act of certainly ethnically biased, right? Because there's a particular group of people that are overrepresented in foster care in British Columbia. That's Aboriginals. They're telling them that, you know, you were born in the wrong body, and we should change that. And transitioning in BC happens very quickly, extremely quickly, and we need to be very careful about that. It's a scary thing, you know. I think that again, you know, I personally, of course, have no truck with the idea of I have no truck with the idea of being born in the wrong body and that sort of thing. I think that God gave us the bodies we have for a reason. And I believe that while there can be plenty of dysphoria, like if I were going to look at you and say, oh, I know exactly what it means to be a true man and to be a good white knight, you know, or to be the proper, perfect man. I don't, you know, I think like any man who actually bothers to think about these things, certainly in the Christian world I come from, questions around what does it really mean to be a man, and like how to be, I guess you could say, godly and that sort of thing. But the point is to be a virtuous man. What does it mean to be virtuous? What does it mean to be a man? And I'm assuming that on the female side, a lot of this is a part of that as well. Though I do believe female biology, by its inherent nature, the way that womanhood comes upon, you know, a young woman, that happens differently for men. And so I do believe there's an asymmetry between the sexes here. We can get into that another time. But the point is that I'm not going to tell you that there's no such thing as being confused or wrestling with the question of, well, I have these biological parts, but I also don't know what it means properly to be holistically a man, psychologically, in my soul and my spirit, who I am as a man or a woman, and then into the wider world. What does it mean to be a man out in the world, to be a woman out in the world? What those tensions between those things, the biological reality, the internal reality, and the external reality. That's not the argument. The argument is that the solution to that, my proposition would be, the solution to that is not surgery and puberty blockers. I would say that deep internal reflection, and then, you know, back and forth with your peers, particularly any experts in this field, which I would prefer, of course, due to my religion, a philosophical and religious sort of perspective on that. But a back and forth on that question, with the understanding being underlying your biological gender, your sexual reality that you can see pretty clearly at birth, right? That's what we want people to be. We want them to holistically identify with how they were born, and we need to do that not by radical surgery, obviously, and changing them, but rather by helping them find that identity and that grounding inside of what it is to be a man or a woman. It's a difficult task. It's not easy. It's been talked about for a long time. So I think that we need to be clear about this, that especially in British Columbia, there's a serious issue going on here. And I think there's a perfect segue here between what's going on in Kamloops and what's going on when it comes to questions around transgenderism and all the rest of it, and the kind of the woke ideology that's going on. And I mean, actually, there's a point here too, because let's do this two ways. I've been using the term theocracy for a long time now on this show. I mean, we're on episode 25 or so we've been at this just over 8 weeks, and I think that what we need to understand is, a lot of people say, well, the reason the residential schools were so bad is because they were religious and that sort of thing. It's like, well, then I'm saying it now, but in another 20 years too, when we realize that a lot of the things that were going wrong inside of public schools today are happening also because they are religious institutions. I'm going to throw that right back at you. You make a profession of faith today in a public school. Every time you say nobody is different, it's like, actually, no, everybody's different. Everybody is a unique soul made by God and a beautiful creature that he hand molded in the womb. But further to that, on a purely material level, no two people, even identical twins, are exactly alike. No two people are exactly alike. Not at all. Not in a single part of their anatomy are they exactly the same, and not in their psychology either, and not in their mannerisms, and not in their characteristics. People are individuals, and they aren't all the same. And there's a diversity in that individuality. It is not a conformity of diversity. And color and race and sexual orientation are just some of the categories where people can be different. It is not the only ways to identify yourself. And I think that we need to understand, right? Diversity is our strength. And even anti-bullying, the idea that there might be tensions between different people. It's not that I want people to bully, but the idea that there isn't going to be, well, quite frankly, there will always be a hierarchy. But apparently now the people on top aren't the people who can take your lunch money. The people on top are the people who can browbeat you the best. I don't know if that's a better world. The browbeaters I find to be quite neurotic, self-important, and sanctimonious. I don't know if I think I might prefer just the old schoolyard bully, because the school marms are far worse. We just lived through it in COVID. It's not worth it. And I think that kind of there's something to be said about this when it comes to this question. It's like, well, the residential schools were badly run because the people of religious conviction, they were just going to answer to God. They weren't going to answer anyone else. Do you think the wokies who are running our public schools right now do they answer to anybody? Do they care? Do they answer to God? They don't answer to God. They don't even believe in a final judgment. They answer to a higher power of ideology. And every child must be indoctrinated. Every child, even the well-behaved, let alone the badly behaved child or whatever they want to curb into their own little personal project. But, even the most amicable, kind people who they know kind of vote conservative or whatever, right wing, and have guns at home and go to church on a Sunday when they were still allowed to go to church. I guess we're allowed back at church now in British Columbia. But even the most kind of middle of the road 90s religious family, because I was born in the 90s. Like, I remember that kind of weird point in history where not everything was completely ideological. At least it wasn't all at the surface. And like, people who were religious and people who went to church on a Sunday, one, they weren't as uncommon, and two, they didn't feel completely out of sync with their culture. They had a lot of questions about it, and they were very upset about abortion, about kind of where same-sex unions were going. Of course, that happened into the aughts, same-sex marriage. They were worried about some of those things. They were worried about children being kind of given a more therapeutic view at school instead of just being pushed through math and writing and grammar and rhetoric and logic. The old liberal arts are the new categories for those things, language arts and the ability to do basic math and science and figure things out for yourself and play on the school ground and just kind of sort out your own life. We had questions about all that, but we were kind of in the middle of the road, and people felt, for the most part, they felt pretty safe inside of their enclaves. And I think that the issue is that, like I said, I'm already saying it today, well, the reason that the public schools aren't doing so well is that they answer to a higher power, and that higher power is ideology, and that ideology is incredibly inhuman, and it makes slaves of us all, terrible, violent slaves to ourselves and to others. And so you go ahead and say whatever you want about the residential school system. I'm not here to fight about the residential school system. I'm here to proclaim that the public school system that we have today throughout Canada, throughout the Western world, but certainly here in British Columbia, even here in my hometown, but definitely down in the Lower Mainland, it's gotten out of control. And there is an ideology running the system, an ideology where standardized testing, no, that's racist, or it's wrong, or trying to put kids through a provincial exam, that's just a wrong way of doing things. But telling them all that they were born in the wrong body, so that it's okay to think that you were born in the wrong body, or it's okay to change something about yourself fundamentally when you are a child, before you're old enough to drive a car or buy a cigarette or go to the cannabis store, and then we don't even have to talk about vices, get married without your parents' consideration. I think the youngest age you can get married in Canada, out in Quebec, I think it actually is below 16 with permission, but still below 16. But the point is that, go ahead and tell me that's not a belief system, a religion, and a fundamentalist one of that, and it gets violent. When we do get Chris on here, we'll talk about that, because we know that he's been attacked. He's been attacked, and something, when that happens, like it's very wrong. It's very wrong. So I think that what we need to do is we need to take a deep breath, and we need to be honest about the fact that what happened in Kamloops was wrong. We don't want children to die in the care of other people, whether the person exerted as much duty as care as possible or was an abusive, terrible, evil, wicked person. Obviously, no child deserves to die at the hands of another person or by the neglect of another person. And all deaths, especially amongst children, are a tragedy even when that person did their best and that child unfortunately dies from a disease or something. That's awful, or in an accident. That's awful. And people don't forgive themselves for that if they have a conscience. Well, it's not that it's their fault necessarily if it's a complete accident or a disease, but I mean, nobody ever forgets that, is what I'm trying to say. No one ever forgets it. But if that's the attitude and the amount of pearl clutching we're going to do over what happened in Kamloops, that's fine. And we should, and we need to grieve, and we need to have catharsis, and we need to address the issue that was there. But simultaneously, then we need to be honest about the ongoing violence against children that's happening right now when it comes to the transgender issue. And it's one thing to be an adult and to decide that you are going to change everything about yourself, perhaps just with the way you dress, or perhaps in the way you talk, or perhaps the name you call yourself, all the way up to radical alterations done with a scalpel that cannot be undone in any seamless way, to put it as politely as possible. That's one thing as an adult. It's quite another thing for a child. And we mean children. And we need to be honest about that. And in 20 years, I mean, I'm a crazy guy out in the wilderness right now. These darn public school systems, said with the same kind of sneer as others say of the residential schools. Those residential schools. Well, these public schools in general right now, the curricula of British Columbia and other places, the same derision that people have, even religious people nowadays, some of them anyways, have for residential schools. I'm using that same kind of sneer and tone and glare towards the question of our current curriculum, to say, look, we are teaching kids wicked ideas, and we're doing it actively, not passively. This isn't just neglect. This is an active choice that's being made. And the irony is that we are looking at a higher power here. We're looking at the ideology, and we need to be honest about that. We've got some comments here. We're still just waiting for our beloved guest in the wings. He'll be along shortly, I'm very, very sure. But let's look at some of the stuff we've got on the wings here. So the Albertan is back. It's good to see him. That's good to see you from our new location. The church has many abuses to answer for, but it would be an injustice to claim that such abuses are the sole domain of religion. The state is complicit in this as well. Yeah, well, I mean, and that's totally true. We're going to bring our guest on in just a moment, but we need to be very clear about that as well. Thank you for bringing that up, because the truth is that it didn't happen. It did not happen without the expressed consent of the state. When it comes to residential schools, and for that matter, they paid for it, right? That we used tax dollars to help make these things happen. So let's be clear about that. That guilt is on all of us in that respect. It was a public project, and so let's be honest about that. We don't get to call any exemption for that. So we're going to bring on our favorite Billboard Chris. There is only one Billboard Chris, but we've got Chris Elston on today, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about what's happening in a world of fighting for the innocence of children and trying to bring BC and the rest of the world back to sanity. Welcome to the program, Chris.
Thank you, Nathan. It's good to be here again. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you, of course, always. Again, I just want to warn both the viewers and yourself that we did just move to a new location, and so we're hoping the internet's going to hold out the whole way through. It could get a little choppy, but we're pretty sure we got enough bandwidth, and there's not enough traffic anywhere else right now. We should be okay. But just as a heads up in case people drop off for what's happening. Let's start from the top here. I mean, I think you're about to go on a big trip. You didn't just come back from it. You're telling me that you're about to go on one. What's the trip for, Chris?
Yeah, I just came back from a little trip. I went to Kelowna, Calgary, and Edmonton.
Awesome.
Because I hang out in busy locations and I have conversations with people about the harm coming at children who are being lied to in our schools and on social media and wherever else into believing that it is possible for them to change their sex and that it's just a simple matter of deciding, because these kids are taught that their gender identity is their true self, and gender identity is basically just an entire this whole ideology, gender ideology, is based on stereotypes. So gender ideology teaches children that stereotypes determine what sex they are. So if a girl is more masculine, that means she's a boy, or maybe she's halfway to being a boy on the spectrum. And if a boy is more effeminate, then that means he has a girl brain or something. The ideology changes its own rules all the time, but we're teaching kids, and it's primarily affecting girls, that they can just opt out of their sex and they can go on these harmful puberty blocking drugs. It's a drug called Lupron in North America that stops puberty from occurring. So you can imagine all the things that happen during puberty won't happen. And then after that, they always go on to the next step, which is the opposite sex's hormones. So girls are taking testosterone, boys are taking estrogen. And oftentimes these girls are getting mastectomies done at the age of 14, 15, 16, even without parental approval. And I don't think the first answer to a child who's having some distress regarding their gender, I don't think the first thing we do should be stick them immediately on pharmaceutical drugs, which have never been tested for this purpose, and then give them cosmetic surgeries to alter their appearance to be more like the other sex. I think this is a bit mental.
I think that's slightly insane, Chris. I have to agree with you. It would also kind of hits me that it seems, I mean, if you tried to float this idea before we kind of got to the boiling point that we're at now, with everybody just turning up the heat just a little bit while we were just kind of falling asleep in that pot, if you tried to bring this idea up even 10 years ago and said, yeah, no, this is what we're going to start doing with kids. I'm going to take, I'm going to tell your little girl who's not even 12 yet, not puberty, I'm going to explain to her that she is now a boy, and don't worry, I've got some drugs in one hand and a scalpel in the other, and she's going to look like, the most beautiful boy who ever lived once I'm done with her. I think you might get punched for that a couple of years back. I think that would go badly for that advocate. It's weird that people
now you get punched for saying the opposite.
Yeah,
because I have been punched a few times and gotten my arm broken in Montreal. And you were talking about another big trip. I'm going on another trip at the end of this week. I leave on Saturday for Toronto, and then I'm heading up to Ottawa, Montreal, and I might get one day in Quebec City. But I'm there for 8 days. I'm going to park myself outside Ottawa for 3 or 4 of those days outside Parliament. And I just go on a bit of faith that when you put yourself out there, sometimes good things happen. So I've run into politicians there in the past, and hopefully I do again. But at the very least, these trips are always a success because I'm always talking to people, and I'm always spreading gospel of gender truth to them. And so then when these parents learn what's going on, then they can protect their own children, because people have no idea what is in our school system and what we're teaching our kids. And I see this as an emergency, because when I'm out there on the streets and I see a group of 4 young girls, young adult women, university age, high school age, I know almost every time I'm about to get in some heat, because this ideology has not just been accepted by a few. It has been accepted by the masses in high school and university. They almost all believe it, except for the boys. There's a big discrepancy between the sexes on this issue. Now, a lot of boys are buying into this ideology, or they at least buy into that they need to be kind and be nice and not, ruffle any feathers about it. And of course, it's always good to be kind, but it's not kind to say nothing when children are being sterilized all across this country. And so, at the very least, I'll do my bit to have one conversation at a time and raise awareness. And this transgender craze that's seducing our daughters, to borrow the title from Abigail Shrier's book, Irreversible Damage,
Mm-hmm.
is a giant problem. And the politicians won't listen. They actually know exactly what's going on, but it's too hot for them to touch. So I just do my part to keep the heat on.
And that's what we have to start with. I mean, until politicians are going to listen and start, well, quite frankly, banning transitioning before you are of age to consent yourself. And at that point, I mean, I personally still don't agree with that, but due to the Constitution and the world we live in, I mean, I must admit that would be under someone's charter rights to make that decision once they're of the age of majority, but certainly not before. I think something that could be brought up here. I tried to make this connection in my opening statement. I'm not sure if you caught much of it. In my opening statement, I was trying to draw a connection between what happened in Kamloops. We've had this shocking revelation, obviously, of the children being found, a grave site, unfortunately, and I mean, unfortunately, also not a surprise anymore to a lot of us that this has happened, and this is evil and terrible, and that's bad. At the same time, people are so dismissive of that. They're like, well, that was the residential school system. I mean, these people were believing in a higher power, and because they believed in a higher power, anything went, and they did whatever they wanted, and it didn't matter. And I sit here, I kind of sat here just before you got on. I said, look, like, people are going to say that 20 years from now about the current curriculum that's indoctrinating children when it comes to transgenderism. I'm saying it now. I sound like a crazy person today, or somebody can try and cancel me today. But you know what? Like, in 20 years, people are going to have to admit that, hey, sterilizing all these kids, that was pretty terrible too. That's as bad as this gravesite we've just found. But are they going to admit
that? Well, politicians will never admit anything. They just twist the narrative and say that they were against this all along. But, you know, Nathan, one important point on that is I just saw a chart this morning, actually, about 19% of kids in Canada who are given these sterilizing, chemically castrating drugs and surgeries are Indigenous, which is totally out of proportion. I think the Indigenous population in Canada is only 2 or 3% or something like that. Don't quote me on that. But the numbers of Indigenous children transitioning are way too high. Some reasons for that are the foster system, where 55% of kids are Indigenous, and then we get maniacs in British Columbia like this psychologist Wallace Wong, who on camera has admitted to transitioning over 1,000 children, including over 500 who are in the foster system. So you're absolutely right. Once again, Indigenous children are being forgotten about, experimented on, and no one's there to advocate for them. So we have a crisis easily as big as what happened with the residential schools. In terms of numbers of children, we're going to see far greater numbers because this is affecting thousands and then tens of thousands over the years. And it's all a lie. It's all a lie. Every single thing that these trans activists or these gender extremists say is untrue. They say puberty blockers are just a pause button that you can fully reverse. They're fully reversible, you know, that there's no damage done. But if you put a child from the age of 11 on puberty blockers until she's 17, how do you get back those 6 years of development? Obviously, you don't. You don't come off puberty blockers and then go through puberty until you're 23. Puberty's gone. You'll never get it back. And they've also, in that time, because we've seen from the studies in the gender clinics themselves, about 98 or 99% of these children go on to the next step of this process, because it is a process. It's puberty blockers, which is this drug called Lupron. Then it is cross-sex hormones, and it's also surgery. And more kids, young adults who have detransitioned are speaking up now. 60 Minutes had a 7-minute segment on their hour-long program. The whole program was about different trans issues, but they focused 7 minutes interviewing these 4 different detransitioners. And it was heartbreaking because these kids all told the same story, how they were rushed into these medical procedures. This one boy, he was only 3 months into the process before he got castrated. So he'd gone on estrogen, and then 3 months later, oh, okay, time to chop off your testicles. We've permanently damaged this boy. He's now detransitioned. He's now a young man. Look what we've done. And these doctors don't know these kids. Last time I was in Ottawa, a mom came out to protest with me, and she told me that this 14-year-old girl had gone to CHEO, which Catherine McKenna is promoting right now, our Liberal politician. This kid had just gone into CHEO, and after one 20-minute appointment, had been injected with Lupron. And this drug, just so people know, this drug was originally given FDA approval to treat prostate cancer and then endometriosis in women. There's never been one single clinical study done for the purpose this drug is being used, which is to stop puberty. It just happens to do that. What it does is it stops the pituitary gland from releasing luteinizing hormone, which in turn trigger the testes to produce testosterone, and it triggers the ovaries to produce estrogen in females. So none of this happens. So none of your secondary sex characteristics, which should be developing during puberty, will happen. And these doctors do this right away. First appointment, these endocrinologists, they will give these kids Lupron to stop puberty happening. And one of the lies that these trans activists tell us is, oh, it's just used so the child can then explore their gender identity and figure out what to do. Well, that sounds all very almost sort of okay, not really. But if you weren't thinking much, you could say, oh, okay, that makes sense. But that's not how this happens. They go on these blocking drugs, they always go onto the hormones, and now they're permanently altered for life, every single time. You can't reverse it. It's not a pause button. Even after you come off of Lupron, it takes quite a while, maybe a year or more, endocrine system to get back functioning properly on its own. I've run into parents whose children have been on Lupron for other reasons, such as a condition known as precocious puberty, where kids are going into puberty very early in like 4 or 5 years. They use this drug to pause puberty then, but then they take these kids off it, and they're supposed to hit puberty at a normal age. And even then, it takes a long time for the system to get back going properly, if it ever does at all. So there's just a whole host of problems. And this is a medical scandal. This has nothing to do with bigotry towards gender, transgender, whatever. This is a medical scandal. We have seen a 4,000, 5,000% increase in the number of kids going to these gender clinics. We used to have a handful of these gender clinics across North America. Now there's 500 or 600 of them. There's wait lists at all these places. They're going to keep opening up more to satisfy the demand. This is just basic capitalism. And it is capitalism because it's a billion-dollar industry for the pharmaceutical industry and for doctors who are making 100,000 a pop on these sex change operations.
I mean, this is the nature of industry, right? This is the nature of any industrial complex that surrounds any social ill. It makes for good money. And I mean, this isn't. We're not here to discuss the residential question, and there were bad things that happened. That's not being argued. But again, even there, an entire grievance industry has been built up, and lots of hand waving and not a lot of action on the actual things that might need to change to help Aboriginal people in Canada. Coming back to this question of advocating for children, especially on the question of sex change, where is that other alternative voice? I believe you're doing it. Where else is anybody talking about how this is killing our kids and this is wrong, and it's robbing us of their future, their own personal future, of being a parent, a mother, a father, and raising their own biological offspring. And for those who are adopted, I'm adopted. It's not a problem to adopt. I just mean that potential, whether they know it or not, whether they are actually fertile or not, that's a different question. But they're being robbed of it before their their testicles even drop or their ovaries even activate.
A lot of these kids are transitioning before they've ever even held someone's hand or kissed a boy. They're destroying all their future sexual function forever. It's just a mess. These kids aren't kids that grew up with gender dysphoria. So I'll answer your question in a second. Let me just backtrack a little bit. gender dysphoria is a condition where there's an incongruity between your birth sex and I guess how you feel. And that's all based on stereotypes, of course, because we associate certain stereotypes with being a boy and we associate other ones with being a girl. So gender nonconformity is a beautiful thing. If a boy is more feminine, a girl is more masculine, whatever, go dress however you please. But when you're 12 years old, we shouldn't be stopping your biological processes and doing cosmetic surgeries on you when you're 14, chopping off your breasts. Like, this is absolute madness. Anyway, where are all the people talking about this? Well, you're talking about it right now. There's some other podcasters in Canada doing some things. There's feminists who are mainly talking online, which is not enough. We need people on the streets. So the answer to your question is there's really nobody. There's just me out on the streets talking to everyday people. And I don't say that to sound braggadocious or something, because I wish there were 10,000 people and I wish I didn't have to do this and I could just go mow my lawn and spend time in my garden. But I felt it was really important to get out on the street and talk to everyday people, because the media report what's going on. And in fact, they're doing the opposite. All of our mainstream media are pushing this narrative. The government is pushing it. This is coming into more and more schools all the time. It's throughout BC, but it's still getting taught more and more. And the rest of Canada is seeing this spread as well. And if you start teaching this to hundreds of thousands, millions of children, because it's going to be throughout all of our school systems, we are going to have an absolutely massive problem on our hands. And I don't know how many thousands of children we need sterilized before some politician wakes up and says enough. But they're all cowards, with the exception of a handful of conservatives who have spoken out against this. And they won't say anything. And the people of Canada, you know, this is really quite predictable, because usually people aren't ever going to protest until something affects them directly. So like we've seen with all the freedom rallies, you know, the anti-mask rallies, people have been affected directly by COVID, so they go out in the thousands and they protest. We've seen Palestinians in the thousands going through the streets because it affects them. The people who this affects are the children who cannot speak out, and the parents of these children who are transitioning, who are now in such a delicate situation because they have to protect their children. They can't speak out. They can't make this a public thing. They can't alienate their child or upset their child. They just have to be there for their child. So it's a really unique situation, because the people who are actually directly impacted aren't usually able to speak. And because we have this cancel culture now, we're even suggesting that a child should do some talk therapy before permanently sterilizing themselves. That's seen as transphobic. And everyone's just afraid of getting canceled. But there's a lot of people who can't speak up, and they should speak up, and they need to start speaking up.
Yeah, they should. Don't check how deep the water is. Just jump. You know, that's a great policy. That's perfect.
Yes, when I started out on this, I mean, I came prepared for a big battle. I deleted every tweet I'd ever written. I deleted all my Facebook posts. I even got rid of all my Facebook friends, because I didn't need people who were kind of crazy taking pictures of my kids and putting them on social media or whatever. I just came at this strategically, and I came prepared for a long battle. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't expect to get arrested a couple times and get jumped by Antifa on the streets of Montreal, but that's okay. Every time something bad happens, it's actually a blessing in disguise, because it helps boost the message and helps reach people. So if people want to keep trying to assault me or whatever, I guess I totally welcome that, because I'll take a broken bone any day of the week if it reaches another million people. But yeah, people just need to get over their fear, because we're on the right side of history. We're telling the truth, and we're looking out for the well-being of children. And if you can't jump into the deep end to save a child, you got no business being a parent.
No, I completely agree. Can we talk a little bit about detransitioning and just, yeah. I mean, I know you're not a medical doctor, sure. And you've been very clear from that from day one, but you know the nomenclature here. You're more aware than most people, and probably a lot of the medical profession, what exactly is going on here. So Nathan,
that's true, because when I was in the hospital, I was enlightening lots of doctors and nurses about puberty blockers, because they'd never heard of them.
Well, that's very interesting.
Anyway,
let me
read
your arm. No, it's not a problem. I guess for some reason, Nathan decides he's going to become Natalie. I'm a 240-pound guy. I'm not going to look like the most beautiful woman in the world, I don't think, but and I'm a consenting adult. This is before, or rather after, I'm not a child, so this isn't a puberty blocking exercise. That's not going to be the same thing. But let's just pretend for a moment that I start taking the estrogen. I get all the surgeries, and now I've been altered. So what I have between my legs is now gone and changed. And I've, maybe had cosmetic surgery to give me some kind of womanly features up here. I go 5 years down this road. I'm just turning 40, like a little ways from there. I decide I don't want to do this anymore. What happens? What happens to get me out of the new body I put myself in?
Nothing happens.
Nothing.
You've already damaged yourself. You're not going to get it back.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's a one-way street. There's no.
I mean, so for girls, when their voice drops, they can do things like they do surgeries and things like that to try to get them a more feminine voice again. It just involves more surgeries, honestly. If a girl's growing a beard, she's not going to get rid of her beard.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to grow your testicles back.
Mm-hmm.
It's done. So it's irreversible damage. That's the problem. And we're doing this on 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds, even younger. But we're socially transitioning these children even younger than that. Because in kindergarten, like I think I probably showed you last time, there's even a lesson plan for kindergartners to practice the pronouns. They'll get a little card saying, "Hi, my name's Tim. Please call me they." And their job is to go around the classroom introducing themselves as that. "Hi, I'm Tim. Please call me they. Hi, I'm Sheila. Please call me he. Hi, I'm Chris. Please call me they." These are 4 and 5-year-olds, and we're already implanting in their precious little brains the idea that sex is changeable. And these kids are coming home and they're telling their moms and dads that they learned at school today that there's really no such thing as boys and girls. There's a woman named Pamela Buffon in Ottawa who is taking the Ottawa School District to the Human Rights Tribunal right now because her 6-year-old daughter came home one day distraught because her teacher told her that boys and girls aren't real. This is insane.
Yeah, might there be anything more? Again, for us who are religious, I mean, obviously we believe in an alternative reality that imbues everything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I understand that that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. I get that, but even if you were being a materialist and an empiricist and like a radical one to the point where like if you don't see it, you don't believe it. I'm pretty sure we all know that like penises and vaginas exist. Like I think we know that, and outside a very small portion of there being hermaphroditism and other odd things going on there, which we all acknowledge are abnormal. Nobody has ever said that those are normal things. What in God's good name could you say other than the fact that there are 2 genders, sexes that are directly connected to biology? We know that. That's empirically observable.
Yeah.
The idea that it might be a little bit dysphoric, like, I mean, do I think I know what being the perfect man is? No, I think that's a journey, a struggle to understand how to be a better man, how to love my woman, do these things better.
I think the perfect man wears a red lumberjack shirt and has a full head of hair and a beard.
There you go. Thank you, Chris. But I wouldn't.
Just to touch on one point you made, though, there's a myth going on around, which is natural because we've always heard this about hermaphroditism, hermaphrodites. No one's born with both sex organs. We're all born male or female. There are disorders of sex development or variations of sex development. The trans lobbyists like to call them intersex people, and they like to call it a different sex. But it just means that things didn't develop quite right. And things might not look the same down there, but everyone's still male or female. Like some men, some boys are born with their testes internalized. So
that's right.
They might appear, this is like Caster Semenya, the track athlete. They might appear to be female at I guess, but they learn later, you're actually a male, and they still produce sperm and they can still get people pregnant. So they're fully male. Because we are a sexually dimorphic species, and it is our gametes that determine our sex. Our gametes are sperm and eggs, and nobody produces both of those. Otherwise, they could get themselves pregnant. So, yeah, there's just two sexes, and that's what it is. Now, gender is all about stereotypes. Gender is about how you present, and gender has been conflated to mean sex. Gender used to be used synonymously with the word sex, perhaps as a more polite word. Instead of saying what sex are you, it was maybe more polite to say what gender are you. And it used to be in the DSM-4 as gender identity disorder. When the DSM-5 came out, so this is the diagnostic and statistical manual that psychologists and psychiatrists use in diagnosing. When the DSM-5 came out in 2013, they changed the name of gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. And I guess their goal was to treat, the depression and the anxiety that surrounded the dysphoria and not call it a disorder. But what we've done now is we've gone from calling it a disorder to calling it dysphoria. Now we teach, just 8 years after gender identity disorder got taken out of the DSM, we teach that gender identity is your true inner self. And how do you determine what your true inner self is, Nathan? Well, you must be a man because you're wearing a lumberjack shirt and you've got a beard. And that's really manly. But maybe if you wore a pink shirt like I did last time on your show, maybe that puts you on the spectrum towards being a girl. Like, this is all insane. If a boy wants to be as feminine as he wants to be, go for it. Chances are he's going to grow up to be gay. And what this whole movement is doing is what we call transing away the gay, because it's taking kids who, probably the majority of whom, will grow up to be gay, and it's telling them that because of stereotypes, they are actually the other gender or the other sex, and the only way they'll feel happier is by physically transitioning, permanently altering their bodies, sterilizing themselves, destroying all future sexual function, and in fact, increasing suicidality. And that's another thing that trans activists lie about. They say that if kids aren't allowed to transition, they will kill themselves. So they'll tell the parents, well, you've got two options here. You can either let your child transition or you can have a dead kid. This is just the worst form of manipulation possible, weaponizing suicide. And it's not even true. If you go to my website under the heading of puberty blockers, I have a subheading there called the studies. And I've listed all the major studies that have ever been done into gender dysphoria, going back decades. And 80 to 90% of these kids, when they're allowed to go through puberty, their dysphoria desists. I also listed off all these different studies about suicides, because it's the first thing I often hear on the street is I'm going to make kids kill themselves because I'm such a hateful person. And it's just not true. Suicide in kids is vanishingly rare. It's not common at all, and it's just a total lie. But it's used because it's effective in silencing debate and shutting people up who would speak out about this sort of thing.
There's something to jump on there, and it is that, look, we, again, for those of us who are more right wing, particularly more socially conservative, I mean, the alphabet soup, as they like to call it, right, the LGBTQ, it keeps growing and growing and growing. From what you're saying, I don't understand why the L, the G's, or even the B's are having any truck with the T's.
Right.
Like, if T's and the rest of them aren't getting along, why is there such intersectionalism? Why are they supposedly in solidarity if the trans part is going to take over all the other parts?
That is a fantastic question, and a lot of the LGBT are not on board with this. They are diametrically opposed to it. There have been groups online forming around the world called LGB Alliance, just LGB, because LGB is all about your sexual orientation. And most everyone agrees that sexual orientation is immutable, and we should never try to change that in a person. But when it comes to the T, that's a totally different thing. That's just saying that you're a different sex than you are. And it didn't used to be like this. Old school transsexuals would have acknowledged that, yes, I'm male, but I'm an adult, and it makes me happier to present as a female. Go ahead, fill your boots. You're an adult. Do what you want. But we're telling these kids today that they have this inner self called their gender identity, which is their real self, and that our biology essentially means nothing. And so when you present this option to all these kids, especially girls who might be having a tough time in adolescence, puberty can be really hard for girls especially. And social media makes everything so much worse. If I could give one piece of advice to any parent out there, your kids don't need social media. They'll be totally fine. My kids are 9 and 11. They're not on it at all. They know they're not going to be on it, and they're happy not to be on it. Use it sparingly for school projects or whatever. Like, you got to use your brain. But kids don't need to be on social media sites like TikTok and Tumblr and Reddit and watching YouTube videos, because there's all these peer teen influencers who are super charismatic, and young adults too, who are grooming these children that they're going to feel way better. And it's totally cult-like. And with lightning speed, these kids who never grew up with any dysphoria get into high school, get all these influences around them. And before mom and dad have a clue what's going on, these kids have changed their name at school, changed their pronouns at school, and the school won't even tell the parents when they do this. And now they're wanting to transition. And some of them will just do this socially for a while, and then they'll grow out of it. But a certain percentage will end up in these gender clinics, straight onto pharmaceuticals and surgeries. And the more this gets into our schools, the more and more this is going to happen. Because the schools are the source of this. Schools and social media. This is no longer a problem of just adult men who have this condition called autogynephilia, where essentially they get aroused by the idea of themselves being gay. This isn't just a problem of adult men wanting to use female washroom and get into female sports. That is a problem. It's a huge problem that we're sending rapists and murderers into women's prisons now because they simply self-identify as a woman. But the numbers aren't huge. The numbers are huge with children. And it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger unless we, you, me, everyone else watching, put a stop to this, because the government's not going to do it and the media's not going to do it. So we can't all go outside and wear a sandwich board like I do, but we can all have conversations with people. We can make posts on our social media groups in our communities. We can talk to our friends and our colleagues. And the more we do this, the more we reach people who can eventually affect change. And the more public opinion changes, the safer it is for our cowardly politicians to do something. And sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your original question. I tend to get on these rants, but
that's why we
yeah.
That's why we like the rants.
But it's just a total disaster, and we've got to do something. So I'm just doing what I can, and that's just have conversations with people.
Mm-hmm.
Give me 1 second. My light went out. You keep talking. I'll keep listening. For sure.
I think the other thing that needs to be kind of noted here is that it's not just that there's transitioning happening now. There's a lack of intersection inside of the LGBT and then the T and then the rest of the community and how things are going there. I think the other part to your point is not just it really is what's going on with the kids, right? Like how did we let this happen to children of all people? Like, those are supposed to be the ones that we protect the strongest, and we've decided that they're not worthy of protection in this area. I'm still just blown away by the idea that we really would want to not just radically alter a child's body or any of that, or tell them that, there's a little person inside of you who's not being properly expressed, but don't worry, this scalpel and these pills will fix that for you. That's all crazy too. But even deeper than that, like, what about the innocence of children? Are children supposed to be asking questions around even their sexual orientation and that sort of thing, like at such a young age? Like, why wouldn't we want children to kind of develop as they are in the biology that they have? And then again, I don't agree with this, but I acknowledge that in a free democratic society, this is what happens. They can make those decisions once they're of age majority. What happened to that? The idea of there being childhood versus adulthood.
Well, that idea is still completely the dominant idea. 9 out of 10 people I talk to on the street completely agree with you and I. It's this extreme minority who are very loud and angry who have managed their activism and through their funds to affect change. So you had asked me before, isn't the LGBT community taking issue with all this transgender stuff going on when it's actually affecting their population? It's affecting kids and young adults who are confused and are in all likelihood gay. So they are speaking up more and more. They're being called bigots, and they're even getting their websites and their posts taken down by big tech, which is kind of hilarious. But there's a long story to this, and I guess when a lot of the gay rights were won, which I consider to be a great thing, all that money and all these organizations had to find a new goal. And so all that money moved on to trans rights. And because this stuff is also crazy, they're not able to tell the truth to accomplish their goals. They have to lie about it in order to win over the population, because it would never fly. So they've been telling a lot of lies. They've been spending a lot of money. And there are some very powerful activists. There are some billionaires who have been splashing money all around. One billionaire trans woman named Jennifer Pritzker, another billionaire trans woman named Martine Rothblatt, another billionaire named John Stryker, who runs this group called the Arcus Foundation. They're extremely strategic and super wealthy, and they've been very successful with their lobbying efforts, as have all these LGBTQ2IAS+ organizations. But many people in the gay and lesbian community are also getting tired of this alphabet soup stuff, because it's just gone way too far. It used to be just about inclusion, about, let people love who they want to love, and why should we care? We shouldn't. But that's not at all what this is anymore. This is about producing body dissociation in children and getting them to go on pharmaceuticals, making billions of dollars for the pharmaceutical industry, and permanently destroying their future, sexual function, sterility, ability to have kids, breastfeed their own children. It's just heartbreaking. So
it is heartbreaking.
We will get there in the end, because we have the truth on our side, and we don't need billions of dollars to tell the truth. We just need more people to tell the truth. And that starts with more people learning what's going on. So I think that's what I'm doing in my own little small
way. Just before we get into how people can help support you and what you're doing, and of course ally with you and work with you in maybe their own communities to try and make that point. I think that you brought up a really interesting point there, and it's something that we have to admit to on the right as well. It was well said once. It's a bit of a leap here, but it all connects. It was well said, of course, that by President Eisenhower at his farewell address, that the military industrial complex was now powerful enough to make its own wars, right? So it had a vested interest in building the weapons that would cause war, and that would take away from the social goods, because you'd spend money on that instead of on building a school or building a road or whatever. And to the same point that you're making there, I think the original element of gay rights was we just want to be left alone. We want to be able to express ourselves and then there was a transition in another generation to, we want to be able to get married, which actually was interesting, because a lot of the older libertines were not interested in that argument. There was a big falling out between the older movement of gay rights into the new movement, and then now, as you've pointed out very well, into the gender rights question and gender arguments and transgender arguments. There's been another thing here. So there's always, whether it's right wing or left wing, whether it's about social progress or about kind of social stability, it doesn't really matter. The point is that there's always vested interests, and they will always act in their interests, and so we have to be careful that whatever we've built up doesn't get away on us. We can create Frankenstein's monster, which is interesting too, to use that analogy, because of course Frankenstein built his monster out of various parts.
Right. Yeah, it's I had a really good thought and I've lost it. But it's a really interesting trick that they've used. Like, they understand psychology. Make it all about being accepting and loving and inclusive, and conflate sexual orientation with gender identity, so that every time you speak about gender identity, you're including sexual orientation and LGBTQ, etc. Who is going to speak against them? Because then they're looked at as being a bigot, not just against what's happening to kids, but against LGBTQ. And so it's just a nice little marketing trick, honestly, to conflate these two things, because then everyone's too confused or too afraid to ever speak up. So we have to separate these issues, and we have to communicate clearly that this isn't about sexuality or any of that. And we have right now this bill going through Ottawa. Just debated it again yesterday. It's called Bill C6. And if anyone wants to do something, please just go Google your House of Commons members. Just Google House of Commons email addresses, and you'll find their site right away. You'll find the email address for your member of parliament, and just send them an email or call them and just say you're not cool with Bill C6, because what this bill is going to do, on the surface, it sounds like a great thing. And the Liberals and the NDP know this, and they know they can use it to hammer the Conservatives, because who wants to speak out against conversion therapy, right? Nobody. This bill is about banning conversion therapy based on someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. So again, they've included these two totally different issues in the same bill, and this bill states that it's a myth that gender identity ever changes. Well, holy cow, how do you explain detransitioners then? They transitioned, then they realized, oh, I was sold a pack of lies and my body's been permanently damaged, and then they detransitioned. Their gender identity changed. So why are we trying to rush through a bill, not allow debate? There were hundreds of briefs submitted to the Justice Committee on this bill, and the members of the Justice Committee weren't even allowed time to read the briefs from all these different individuals and organizations. But they're trying to slam through this bill, which will make it a criminal offense punishable by up to 5 years in jail for any counselor, parent, pastor, anybody. But what really gets me is the parents and the professional licensed counselors. If a professional counselor has a practice treating dysphoric children, and trust me, if you treat dysphoric children, your practice will be booming, because there aren't enough practitioners who specialize in this field to talk to all the kids. I've had parents reach out to me looking for help, and I've helped them to find help. But a lot of these practitioners are just completely overwhelmed and don't have time to take any more children. But what this bill is going to do is make it a criminal offense if they're deemed to be trying to convert the gender identity of a child. So what does that even mean? We don't know, because they won't define it properly in the bill. But what it will do is put a chill across this whole psychological profession, where these counselors will be too afraid to treat these children with talk therapy, with watchful waiting, just making sure they're okay, helping them out, letting some time pass, because this is a phase, and it's almost always a phase. If it's not a phase, that's pretty rare, but it's almost always a phase. And what we're seeing now today, even higher numbers of these kids are going to desist, because these aren't children that have gender dysphoria from the age of 3, 4, 5, 6. These are primarily girls who get into high school, and there's all these different influences, all these cult-like influences, and only then are they saying that they're the other gender. But they're all going to grow out of this, because it's not legitimate gender dysphoria. That's what we're seeing. So anyway, this bill will make it a criminal offense if counselors just do talk therapy. They're going to be at risk of an activist coming for their business, and they'll be in court defending their practice, seeing their reputation get dragged through the mud, and they're just not going to do it. They're not going to treat these kids. So then what happens? And sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but some of these things need to be addressed in detail. What will then happen is these kids will end up at the gender clinics of these children's hospitals, where on the first or second appointment, first appointment might be with a nurse or a social worker just to gather their information. But these people are what we call affirming nurses only. They do what's called gender affirming care. So if you follow this issue at all, and you follow the issue where different states in the United States are trying to ban these drugs, these harmful treatments, you'll see all these news articles about how these politicians are against gender affirming care. And that sounds really lovely. What a great term, gender affirming care. It just sounds loving, doesn't it? What it means is pharmaceuticals straight away, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries. How is it gender affirming care to take a 12-year-old and inject them with a chemical castration agent within 20 minutes of meeting them for the first time? I call this a chemical castration agent because it is. This drug has been used on the worst sex offenders. It's been used on pedophiles to chemically castrate them, and it's had success. And this is what we give kids for years and years. This is completely bonkers. So anyway, I don't even know what I was talking about, but gender affirming care, another lie from trans activists. They just try to market everything and dress it all up to sound loving and beautiful. And it's the exact opposite. It's gruesome, it's barbaric, and it's sterilizing an entire generation of gender confused teens who are getting confused because of what we're teaching in the school systems and what they're getting on social media. So parents, please monitor your child's social media and talk to their teachers, get involved a little bit at school. You don't got to get involved in the pack, but what you do have to do is make some noise with the teacher at the start of the year. And if I find out my kid is learning this gender ideology garbage, I'm going to pull him out of class and I'm going to make some noise. And this is really effective because teachers don't like getting complaints from parents. And when they have all sorts of different things they can teach or teach in a different way, if they know there's pressure on them, and if you, the parent, start educating these teachers as well about the harm coming to this, they're going to be far less likely to teach it. And I know there's a lot of teachers out there who aren't teaching this and won't teach it. They'll do the bare minimum if they have to, but that doesn't stop your kids from getting indoctrinated either, because schools will bring in outside speakers to talk to the whole school, and they show different videos. And you can go to the SOGI Education website, which is bc.sogieducation.org. You'll find it on my website as well, billboardchris.com, under gender ideology in schools. And you can check out all the lesson plans for yourself. But this comes with a caveat. Those are just options for teachers to use. All the lesson plans that are provided to achieve the goals of the curriculum are all optional for these teachers, because teachers have autonomy to teach as they see fit. So they can just go on the internet and find some videos, which they do, and they'll show those videos to their class. So I don't know if I talked to you before or after I leaked this audio from Toronto last month, but a 12-year-old boy in a Toronto classroom at a school called Bowmore Road, Bowmore, located in the Beaches area of Toronto, which is a pretty wealthy liberal area. This child recorded his teacher, and the father leaked the audio to me. It's about a half hour long, and this lesson is just incredible. It's disgusting. About 6 or 7 times, at least, in videos and in what the teacher is saying, they are grooming these children to reject their parents. The teacher literally says, you know, sometimes our parents don't understand things as well as we do because they're not having conversations about these things like we are in grade 7. And just planting these seeds, seed after seed, to get these kids to reject their parents. So they get indoctrinated in school into believing this gender identity crap, pardon me. Then they go home and they also have been indoctrinated to already reject their parents' objections to this. So it's just really insidious, and kids' minds are very malleable, and it does not take long at all to mold them into believing this, because they are steeped in a school system that preaches and this and teaches, you know, you have to be kind and be encouraging and all that sort of stuff. So they all want to be kind and they all want to be encouraging, and that's great. But this is another thing that these activists have succeeded in doing. All these teachings are tied together with anti-bullying and sexual orientation stuff. And nobody wants to be against bullying, obviously. No one wants to be against sexual orientation stuff. And so no one dares to speak up about the gender identity component of these lesson plans, because then it just looks like, oh, you're against bullying. We're just teaching to be nice and to be kind, to be loving. But all along this whole process, these kids are getting indoctrinated. It's like a psychological way. And when you put kids who, you know what, it's hard enough for an adult to come out on this and speak against it because they're all worried what their friends and their family are going to think. There's going to be such a bigot or they're going to get fired. What kid is going to speak out against this ideology when the entire school, the principal, the vice principal, all the teachers, everyone everywhere is teaching that we have to be on board with it? They're not. And so when I talk to these kids privately, some of them, especially the boys, they're not on board with this and they're glad I'm doing this. But girls are a lot more empathetic than boys in general. Of course, these are all generalities, but it's true. And girls all know girls who have transitioned or are transitioning socially or physically. And so they want to have nothing but empathy for their friends. And that's a big reason why I get so much hate from males, especially on the street, because they all know other females who have gone through this. So it looks like I'm hating on their friends. But I'm doing the exact opposite. I'm trying to, of course, speak out against, medical malpractice and be proactive for the next generation of kids so they don't get drawn into this. And it's my hope that I never hear about any good things that have come about from my activism, because that means that kids and parents learned the truth before any of this harm ever happened. So then none of this harm will ever happen and I'll never hear a word. And that's totally great by me. That's all I want to achieve, is just achieve broader awareness so that parents can protect their kids. And it's not complicated, guys. All you have to do is have a conversation with someone to get this ball rolling. And especially with parents, they will be interested, because if they have kids in school, they're going to want to know what's coming down the pipe, because they need to protect their own kids. And so, yeah, maybe be tactical about it, but we definitely need to have more conversations.
Perhaps just as we close out here, Chris, maybe you can tell us again just how exactly we can support you in your work, and maybe even if somebody who's watching the program right now or listening to the podcast later wants to invite you to their town, their community, or offer you a place to stay, especially during pandemic, or cut down on hotel bills and that sort of thing, how would they get into contact with you to try and both stand in solidarity with you from afar, or perhaps when you come to their community they can stand in solidarity with you there?
So check out my website, billboardchris.com. There's a donate button on there. They can donate to help support my travels, because it is really expensive and I'm not really working much at all, because I consider this my job now. But whatever, I'll be fine. But if people can donate, that's great. It helps me to do more. I have a whole lot of ideas that I can't do because it takes funds, but that would be great. I do most of my campaigning on Twitter. They'll find my Twitter account on my website as well. But that's where I usually state where I'm going to be. And so on Saturday, I'm flying to Toronto. I'll be posting my itinerary on Twitter again. I'll put it up on my website too. But if people want to come and stand with me when I'm in their town, that'd be great, because the more numbers we have, the more impact it has. And if people just want to reach out to me and talk to me, I'm always happy to talk to anybody. If they have questions, my contact info, my email, and my phone number are public on my website. I'm not hiding at all. And curious enough, I'm not even getting any hate these days, because I guess I've blocked it all. But I've learned that it's really not that scary to go public and do this stuff. It might be in the beginning because there's the unknown, and the unknown is always scary. We're fearful of the unknown. But honestly, guys, it's really not that bad. And if you're going to do one thing productive in your life, you might as well speak up for the health of kids. I don't mean to say one thing productive, but if you're going to step out of your comfort zone and do something, it might as well be this issue. Because as any parent would understand, there's nothing more important than the health and well-being of our kids. So yeah, check out my website, reach out to me, donate, it's all good. Whatever people want to do. Yeah.
Absolutely. Perhaps is one other thing for me to bring up, and maybe that's a conversation for outside of this forum. But I would also, I don't know if you have any other allies in your battle, or other people who have been, a listening ear in broadcasting, whatever else, or people that you've consulted as experts who, have not had a chance to make a public statement. But I would be happy to have them on the show to give them a place to make their point on what's happening here and how to protect our children.
Okay, I will keep that in mind. There are, like, sometimes I partner up with some organizations, like in Montreal next Saturday, or no, next Friday. What day is that?
That's the 11th.
Yeah, on the 11th from 4 to 6 p.m. on St. Catherine Street in Montreal, which is where I was attacked by Antifa. There's a feminist organization called PDF. It's in Quebec. A bunch of women are coming out, hopefully with their husbands as well, because we need some protection. And that'll be great, because that's going to be a proper protest with some proper numbers out there, and maybe some media will get involved. And we're trying to get some police presence there as well. But there are other organizations that I partner with from time to time. But I'm pretty much a lone wolf doing this. I don't work well with seeking group agreement or approved messaging. I'm just doing my own thing and having conversations with people one person at a time.
Fair enough. You're a one-man wolf pack. That's great.
I'd like a wolf pack, but it's just the way it is. I'm kind of a spontaneous guy, and I just kind of do whatever I feel like on some days. And so, yeah, I like to be flexible.
No, I totally understand. That was a bad culture reference.
Yeah. No, it's all good.
No, again, we're just very thankful for you to be here, Chris, and to explain all this to us, because it's such a touchy topic, but you talk about it with such frankness, but also clarity, and you're not crass. You deliver it well, and it's important for people to just hear it as it is to be heard. This is killing our kids. It's sterilizing them. It's robbing us of future generations. And I guess as a final point on my end, speaking of conversations, I mean, I was inspired by you. So I was in a conversation with actually some future in-laws, not my direct in-laws, but the aunt and uncle sort of thing.
Yeah.
I was in a conversation with them, and I tried to bring this up as gently as I could. As a guy, they happened to be directly related to a guy who I went to high school with, graduated with. And I would last guy in the world, I would have thought that. Now, he's not a child, obviously, anymore. Like, he's an adult, like, he can make his own choices and whatever. But a lot of this seemed to be tied up in a sense of depression and everything else. It didn't seem to be tied up in a sense of expression, but rather a sense of retreat, and trying to safety. And I simply brought up as gently as I could that, all the way back to the beginning of to 2 millennia ago, there's been arguments around the questions of gender and for that matter, what's your true soul and your true body and that sort of thing, all the way to today. And that people who have done it often aren't necessarily happier later, even if they're adults and they were fully consenting when it happened. I just brought that up as gently as I could and everything else. And it's amazing that it is like a cult. This was the point I had forgotten, or I wanted to bring this earlier up in our conversation. But you're right, it is like a cult, because they were so married to the idea they couldn't even have a conversation about it. They got extremely frustrated. They didn't curse at me or anything, but they just clearly we weren't allowed to have this conversation just because we weren't allowed to have it. There was no room. And I think that you're right. We have to have these conversations, because that's one person, but another person might be a bit more receptive. The next person might be looking for an answer. And we can't allow this to be swept under the rug. If we don't have these conversations, there will be no conversations.
Yes, I'm really glad you brought up a couple points there. So the first point is virtually all these children, when they go on these drugs, etc., they all have comorbidities. They all have something else going on. They have anxiety disorders, depression. A lot of these kids have autism. A lot of them have had trauma. Some of them have had sexual trauma. And the pornification of our culture is also not helpful, because porn is so widespread now, and all these young watching it. Girls see it too. And it makes sexuality look very unappealing. And so there's various reasons a lot of these girls today are wanting to kind of get out of their own skin and become a boy. It seems a lot easier. But all these kids have comorbidities going on. They all have depression going on. They've got something else, and we don't treat it. These endocrinologists, these nurses, these doctors at the children's hospitals, at all these gender clinics, they do nothing to find the source of this dysphoria. There is no other condition in this world where a child self-diagnoses, has all these other things going on, and the doctors just go straight away with the child's diagnosis. Yes, Jimmy, you are a girl because you say you're a girl. And now I'm going to block puberty and we can cut off your testicles in a few months. What's the point of going to medical school if all you do is affirm the child? This is nuts. But the second point you made there about conversations, how you might broach this subject with somebody and it immediately becomes heated. Don't keep pushing. You have to be strategic about these conversations. So the goal of that conversation with someone who really doesn't want to talk is really just to plant a seed in their mind. So it might be really effective to say something like, I think gender nonconformity is a beautiful thing, totally fine. And why does that mean that we need to sterilize children? Why does that mean we need to put them on drugs? Why can't we just leave them be to be gender nonconforming? What's the problem? And all that does is just get their head thinking a little bit, because this is a cult. And there's already all this indoctrination done in their brain. There's already all these, neurological pathways formed, which are guiding them. And you have to undo that over time. You can't do it all in one conversation. When someone is kind of a blank slate and they're open to learning, then you can have a full conversation about all these things. But in a way, we need to deprogram people first. And that word is a charged word because it's associated with deprogramming people from religions and stuff like that. But they first need to figure out what they've been told is what part of it is a lie. And they just need to get thinking about it. So what you did with your future in-law there is powerful, because you at least started the conversation and you got things going in their mind. And I guarantee when these people go home at night and they're in bed, they're going to think about these short conversations that they had. And they might pull out their phone and Google something, start learning something. Because Rome isn't built in a day, and you don't undo all these lies that are in a person's head overnight. So just do whatever you can, use your brain, try to get 1 or 2 points driven home, and just leave it at that. And with people that are more open to this, you can have a full conversation and really get involved. No matter what, even when people are getting angry and getting all emotional, it's still a successful conversation because you got them thinking. And don't come at it from bigotry. Don't get involved emotionally. Don't react emotionally yourself. Just say, look, I think gender nonconformity is fine, and this isn't about gender issues, it's about health issues, and why our hospitals and courts around the world, like in the High Court, we just had the High Court in England in December say that children can't give informed consent to these puberty blockers. And in Sweden, we just had, I think it's the biggest hospital in Sweden that does this with children. They just stopped the process altogether on their own. And they said they don't have any scientific studies. There's no science at all to support the treatment pathway that these children are going on. So they stopped it for all kids 16 years of age and under. And for those who are 16 to 18, I think this hospital is called the Karolinska Hospital in Sweden. All the kids that are 16 and 18 can only go on these drugs if they're part of an approved clinical study, which is really important. I still don't agree with it at all at that age, but it's way better than what we've got, because these kids will be properly screened. It's not going to be a child that just showed up with gender dysphoria last week who's now going into this trial. It's going to be someone who has had sustained dysphoria throughout their life, or for years anyway. They're not going to have comorbidities going on like other depression, whatever, that might be causing this. They're going to need to qualify for this trial, and then they'll be closely monitored on this trial. Whereas what we have now is just the wild west of medicine, where without knowing anything about these children, they're getting injected with fun and having their future lives irreparably harmed. So we are making progress in some areas, and it's important to bring up things like that, or even just send these studies or send these articles to antagonistic people, because people don't like to be wrong, most of them. Some do, and those ones are the ones who thrive in life because they learn. But the ones that don't want to be wrong, they need to be able to save face. And so it does no good to argue with them vehemently, but you might be able to plant a few seeds and send a few articles and get them thinking and get them to come to these understandings on their own. It's like the Socratic method of debate. You ask questions to get people thinking. You don't just tell them what to think. You ask them questions so that they can come to these conclusions on their own.
No, a very fair point. A very fair point. Thank you so much again for joining us, Chris. And we do hope to see you again soon. We'll see you, maybe later this month or into July. You can tell us about how some of your adventures have gone. And again, of course, we want everyone to support Chris through billboardchris.com. Show him that you support him either through a donation, or when he is coming to your area, you can follow him on Twitter. You'll know where he is. Go and stand with him and help have those conversations with people. Convince people our children are worth protecting, and that we can have a world where innocence isn't just violated by everyone and everything.
Thank you so much for having me, Nathan. I'll come on anytime. I really appreciate you helping to boost this message.
I completely appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Absolutely. Well, we had Chris Elston on there, and we were just happy to be talking about what the transgender issue is in British Columbia and how it does directly connect to what's gone wrong in a lot of the BC curriculum, as well as the rest of Canada. There are various laws coming forward, etc., that are going rather sideways. He was talking about Bill C6, I believe, and that needs to be discussed in Parliament. And you do need to email your MP and let him know, or her know, that they need to protest this while they can and vote against it if they can. We're actually going to have to do a quick endorsement here, and this is for, I believe, a coffee company that has been with us for a little while. This is our first endorsement on this show. We haven't done a lot of commercial stuff here, and that's the Resistance Coffee Company, which I believe is, there we go, there it is. Yeah, so the Resistance Coffee Company, they've been sponsoring, I think, the Western Standard, or advertising with them for a few months now, and we're thankful for their support. And of course, if you're looking for coffee, look for Resistance Coffee. I must admit that I'm not sure about its availability here in British Columbia, etc., but I will get more on that when the script is developed. But I'm just thankful to have a sponsor for the show, and that's Resistance Coffee. It's made here in Canada, and do support local. We need more of our dollars to stay on our shores. So what I think, if we're going to close out this show, at least for the time being, one of the things that kind of occurs to me as we kind of traipse around some of these issues, some of these very serious issues, right? We started the day off with residential schools, then we got into transgenderism. If you talk about an intersectionality of getting canceled, tough topics to talk about, things that are going to get you in trouble. I think we found them. It ultimately, one of the themes we visit on this show a lot is the idea of solidarity and people working together. But even more fundamental of that is that, you are the world you build, right? I mean, how we act is the world, right? And the world that we have right now is a rather inhuman place, and it doesn't matter which way you're kind of looking at it. If you're looking at the cost of housing, the lack of availability of family supporting jobs, if you're looking at our political systems, which seem completely powerless, being run by people who are unelected with an agenda, while the people who are elected also have an agenda that is effectively to give more of the unelected people power. If you're looking at the cost of just living in general, or what's being taken off your check when it comes to tax time, let alone how things are going in interpersonal relationships. People are getting more divided. People are not able to have the conversations they had last year or the year before that. Things are getting very politically charged. There's a lot of disruption. Right down to families. And I mean, the pandemic has been a great winnowing fork of this as well. As I've said before on this show, I was in a very small community throughout the highest days of the pandemic in 2020. I watched a community that couldn't be divided by race, by culture, anything else. It couldn't be divided. remained a small, solid community. I saw the pandemic, the virus, the mask mandates. I saw that divide them and have people not come to blows, but fight each other over the ways to properly protect themselves, their children, their families, and whether or not the virus was really that great of a threat. So I mean, we live in a very divisive time, and I think that kind of talking about these tough topics, whether I get to have, a lovely guest like Chris on to really explain some of these things to us. Tomorrow, we're going to have my buddy Aaron on. He just got canceled, actually. That's why we're having him on tomorrow. Aaron Ekman's going to be here to talk about the fact that he just got fired via Twitter from the UNBC board, as to say the University of Northern British Columbia board, as the board chair. He was the chairman of that UNBC board, and he has been dismissed by the Minister of Advanced Education, being called all sorts of nasty things. We're going to bring him onto the program tomorrow and let him give his side of the story. He went to the local guys first here, CKPG in Prince George, and now he's going to come to us. He's not interested in talking with the big state media because, of course, they're just going to throw accusations at him. We're really interested to see what Aaron has to say about being finally a part of the canceled group of people. But we have these tough topics for a reason. The reason we have these tough topics is, again, it's not just a question of finding solidarity, finding people who, we probably disagree on a lot of other issues, but we can work together on this issue. It's more fundamental than that. Is, again, we are the world. It is our actions that make up the world. And we aren't going to have a more human world if we don't act more humanely to one another, right? And a fundamental part of this being able to have a conversation with somebody, treat them like another human being, respect that you might have a difference of opinion, but that both of you are not neither of you is interested in the other person starving to death. Neither of you is interested in, the world falling apart and everything burning down. You want the world to be a better place tomorrow than it was today, and you want your children to grow up in a better world than you had. And that's actually the kind of scary thing, especially for people my age. I'm 31. I belong to that transitional generation that saw the wealth of the previous 2-3 generations and the benefits that they had, the things that went really well for them, just not materialize for my generation in any sustainable way, not in that perfect compression of 20, 30, or 40 years, depending on where you're counting from after the war, of just being able to afford a house, raise a family, etc., on a single income that was pretty good. You had a pretty good life in those years. And my generation is living in the kind of echoes of that, but everything is not quite lining up for us in the same way. And so I think that there's a place there where we have to look for a way to make a better world and to find a way to reach across the aisle. When we're talking about the children that we want to protect here, there are children with legitimate questions around their sexual orientation and their gender identity, and they are very confused. And I started the show off by saying to you, I don't know what perfect manhood is. This is an ongoing debate inside of my Christian milieu, to use Aaron Ekman's favorite way of saying group of people or gestalt. I don't know what the perfect thing of that is, or to say really more directly, maybe my religion has a model for that, and that of course is my savior. But further to that, and in motherhood, I suppose his dear blessed mother, whom we all love and adore. But the point that I'm trying to draw here is that I wrestle with that as just a man trying to be a better man. How much more so a child in a more confused time than even I was raised in. That was confused enough compared to my parents and grandparents. In a more confused time, trying to understand what it means to be a boy or a girl, and then becoming a young man and a young woman. And so those conversations are where it starts. If you want that better world, it starts with the conversations to build it, right? Either we can all dominate one another, or we can use our free speech and our collaborative ability and communicative ability to create a more sustainable future, and to make a world where, people feel at home and they feel safe and they're able to actually, seek prosperity, to pursue happiness. We want to use the American version, or to have security, the person. We want to use the Canadian version. And without that fundamental holding of one another with a respect and dignity for those of us who believe in that higher power because they're a child of God and created in his image, and for those who don't, because we are the only species that is our species, and we are the only ones capable of doing what we can do, and we are the only ones with completely free will. Not that we don't have determinacy, just that we're not animals, but not everything is instinct for us. So whether you want to come at it from a materialist or a theological perspective, there's a reason to hope, and there's a reason to be trying to save one another and save ourselves through collaboration and communication. And that's the great danger and evil, I think, of what's happening right now with anything. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about corporatocracy or political correctness or transgenderism. That's not what matters. What matters is that deep down inside, it's coming down to a lack of honesty, and that's honest communication, right? We are living in an empire of lies. You know, a BC bungalow isn't worth $450,000. I'm sorry, it's not. And neither can a boy become a girl or a girl become a boy. That's a lie. And so in our empire of lies, in our we're all emperors with no clothes on, accusing everybody else of being the ones who are exposed. And we're living in this time of lies, and because it pays to lie, right? It pays to massage the truth, spin the news, give a fake accounting of things. It pays, right, to profit, or to bear false witness against your neighbor, right? That was a commandment that we were not supposed to trespass, but it profits, right? There's one thing to lie, it's another thing to profit by your lie, right? It's one thing to kind of borrow something without asking, or maybe on a more permanent basis. It's another thing to take something off of someone and sell it at a profit. And this is exactly it. There's that difference. There's that deep difference, right? And we are living in a time of lies, a time where the truth is outlawed, and lies are what's in the papers, or what's being talked about. It's what's being promoted in our parliaments. Lies are coming out of the mouths of politicians who don't even know what they're saying, right? There are more than two genders. A boy can be a girl, a girl can be a boy. It doesn't, interest rates being infinitely low, that can go on forever, because cheap debt never hurt anybody. This is all, like, any history book could tell you that. I'm surrounded by history books down here. We happen to move into a dear friend's place here, who also happens to be associated with an organization that we'll be talking more about hopefully in the future when we get things sorted with advertising, that sort of thing. But nonetheless, like, I'm sitting here in a college professor's basement. It's full of history books, and every single one of these books around me says in no uncertain terms, one, people repeat history, probably because they don't read it. Mark Twain, I think, said it doesn't often repeat exactly, but it often rhymes. And further that, it explains in no uncertain terms that the way that we got to those tragic moments, those terrible moments of the 20th century, the terrible moments throughout all of human history where people did violence to one another in grotesque fashion, and millions of people died. It all came back to the fact that we started telling lies and believing lies instead of having open communication. If you want a more human world, you have to build a world where the truth is what reigns supreme. And that's why I have a great deal of respect for Chris and for lots of people we try to bring on the show, everybody we bring on the show, because they give us an honest opinion. This is the no cancel zone. This is the you say what you need to say zone. This is where, as long as we can go on for, we will bring on people who tell us the honest to goodness truth and what we can do to improve our world. We're actually going to end the show a little bit earlier today. I just want to bring you guys up to speed on a couple of things. We are going to have Aaron Ekman on tomorrow to talk about being canceled and what that means. So we're going to have him on. He's going to be streamed in. He's not going to be in studio. We are now in a very narrow space. We don't have exactly a lot of room to put a second person here. So we're going to try that at a different time. And throughout the week, we'll definitely go to Stuart Parker, certainly at the end of the week, when we talk to him about what happened in Kamloops and the residential school system. I promise you there's going to be some controversial opinions, especially for people who are more right-wing on this viewership. It's going to be tough, but we're going to get through it. Nonetheless, we're gonna kind of close out here on that thought of telling the truth. Tell the truth always, speak the truth, walk with integrity, and do show solidarity with those who do. Final point on my end, again, suggestions for guests. Now that we're in our new space, now that there's a little less stress, please send me any questions, comments, concerns you have about the show. I'm going to put up the email there just very briefly. We do need people suggested for this show. I just was talking with Chris about that a minute or two ago. Send me suggestions for the show, people I can bring on to the show. We need to line up some more guests. We need to get this a little bit tighter and figured out. We've been at this for 8 and a bit weeks now. We got to make things a little bit smoother. We are running this a bit on a shoestring and whatever, trying to do this as best we can. But we appreciate your comments, appreciate your ideas, and thank you so much for your viewership. We are going to see you tomorrow, bright and early, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain.